Remington Arms had created one of the world's most iconic rifles just in time to miss the US Civil War. But 50 years later, it would still be going strong enough to see service in the Great War. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the French-contracted, US-made Fusil Model 1915, a Remington rolling block. Let's go get it over to the light box. At 45¼ inch long and weighing in at 8.4 pounds, this is a handy but somewhat stout rifle. It is a single shotgun chambering the 8mm Lebel cartridge in this iteration, although we will talk about some others. Now usually when we start to talk about one of these firearms, I'll go into the history of the company itself. But Remington is very old and very storied, and we would be here for a lot longer if I did all that. So we are going to focus down on the rolling block alone. Remington's history will come out in bits and pieces as we talk about other guns later on in the series. So when we get to the rolling block, we first have to start with the War of Northern Aggression. This Civil War was anything but. Fraught from 1861 until 1865, it would serve as a proving ground for a number of new military technologies, many in small arms. A wide variety of guns would be fielded with a heavy mix of foreign and domestic designs. And right smack in the middle of that came this little rifle, although not in time for service. Instead, we're going to see one of those rare instances of what appears to be a simultaneous invention, because there are two claims to be the originator of the primary ideas of this rifle. In reality, I think if we look closely at the patents, it seems like this is a blended idea, but it's going to start with Geiger. You see, the first patent to feature the core design elements of this breech loader to be was issued to Leonard Geiger in 1863, and would later be issued in 1866, hence the markings on the tang of early rolling blocks. In 1864, apparently unaware of the Geiger patent, a Remington employee named Joseph Ryder patented his own idea for an interlocking hammer and rotating breech block. While working up the Ryder patent into a rifle, Remington found out about the earlier Geiger patent, and so they had to buy it. But it had since been sold to a man named Cyrus Alger, who apparently had some sort of agreement with the original Geiger for fees, because both of those men, being paid repeatedly by Remington over the next 20-30 years, they were going to make a lot of money. But they're no longer really central to the story. Instead, we have to talk about Ryder, who developed both of these ideas fully into what we will know now as the old model carbine. We are not going to go into a lot of detail on all these variants, but it's worth showing the evolution of the design. This first version sold 5,000 units to the US government, with the contract signed in March of 1864. Because of the low-pressure rimfire cartridge, Ryder had the hammer falling in a gap in the top of the breech block, hence the name split breech. Another contract was signed in October of 1864, this time for 15,000 carbines in the 56 Spencer cartridge. That required scaling up the design, resulting in the large frame model. Now, neither of these guns would arrive until September of 1865, after the conflict had already ended, so they were almost immediately declared surplus, and they would be resold actually a couple years later in 1870 to Remington. Try to remember that, guys, because it's going to come back up in a moment. Anyway, there are going to be other U.S. Marshall Remington rolling blocks, but we are not going to go into all those. We are making a beeline and hitting the key points right up to France in World War I. So, I do, however, need to mention two very specific people who were instrumental to the monumental success of this particular gun. First up, our friend from the previous Lewis gun episode is back. Marcellus Hartley had formed the firm Schuler, Hartley & Graham back in 1854, and as his partners either retired or passed away, it whittled down to just M. Hartley & Company by 1900. Hartley would be a major marketer and seller of Remington products, especially in the commercial and secondary market. We won't get to talk a lot about his role, however, because we're going to be focused on the new made military aspect. Hartley is especially important because while you cannot argue against the creativity at Remington, they brought excellent products, they had amazing rifle designs and things like that, but they were mismanaged. They were mismanaged all the way into the ground. As a matter of fact, by 1888, this family-owned business, the longest, most storied in American history, it was being sold. And it was sold to one Marcellus Hartley, because in the years that he had been selling Remington products, he had sort of fallen in love with the intellectual property of the company and understood how just poorly run it was. And under his guise and his grandson, it would continue to grow and prosper into the turn of the century. That grandson would inherit the company after Marcellus passed away, and he would merge it with the family's other holding, Union Metallic Cartridge, in 1911. Again, while Hartley was responsible for the bulk of Remington's fame, the military contracts were the work of another man, our second important name of the show. I was unable to find a portrait of Samuel Norris, so here is my artistic interpretation. Remember those split-reach carbines? Well, they were actually produced over at Savage, and Norris was a principal investor in Savage and was there to meet with Remington during those contracts. And through that, he had made a very fortunate friendship, as we'll see. Like Hartley, Norris had seen the potential of the Remington rolling block, and he wanted in on that deal. So he would agree to be Remington's agent in Europe and try to sell the gun to the military powers there for a cut of the action. He would head over to Paris in 1865 and begin his work right away, most notably and first of all with Austria-Hungary. You see, the dual monarchy had just had its double ass handed to it by the Prussians in a 2-month conflict during 1866. A major contributor to their defeat came from the Austrian use of muzzle loaders against the superior German Dreyse needle rifle. In September of 1866, Norris would repeatedly demonstrate an American-made and American-ammunitioned Remington rolling block to the Austro-Hungarians. Now, this would fire 2,000 rounds without any problem whatsoever. It would be subjected to sand, mud, and rust, purposefully rusted and then shot. They also loaded it with double charges and shot. No problems, no failures. A beautiful, wondrous weapon. They were incredibly impressed, but there was one big standing problem, which is that Austria-Hungary had not yet modernized in terms of machinery in order to produce a gun as well fitted as one of these guys. So they wanted to make sure that they could do domestic production, and there was a contracted Viennese gunsmith who licensed in order to produce the Remington rolling blocks ahead of this because he eagerly saw this contract coming. As a matter of fact, to some sources it says a couple thousand got made, and these would end up in China for obvious reasons in just a moment, because these Viennese-made guns and new Austrian-made ammo, this is all cutting edge for them. This is all untried. It's a rimfire cartridge. You guys know you have to distribute that primer in there just right. There's so many things that can go wrong. Well, they didn't test the Austrian-made one. They tested the American-made one. But when the Emperor showed up, well, you can't give Kaiser Franz Joseph I a foreign-made gun. You want to give him the Austrian one. So when he fired it in December of 1866, he happily raised the gun, aimed, squeezed, and click. You know, sometimes the quietest sounds are the most deafening, because that turned out to be a problem. Interestingly enough, from accounts, it seems that it wasn't a problem that day. Everybody present, including the Kaiser, seemed to understand that this was the experimental gun, and they had just seen the American one doing great. Nobody was that worried. But it made it to the press, and there were a whole slew of Austrian and Hungarian arms makers who were looking at this big change coming over the hill. I mean, suddenly the Empire is actually looking at foreign-made weapons, and that's a threat to their domestic production. They don't want to pay licenses to other people. They're smart. They can design modern weapons. They don't want the Empire going to somebody else for guns, and so they whip the media into a froth. I mean, they run articles to the point that the government has to threaten censure, and the big takeaway for them, the big announcement that they're making is that they put an American gun in the Emperor's hands and it failed and he could have died and all this. I mean, just the grandeur of it is ridiculous. But there was enough problem building from it that it caused them to delay the adoption of the rolling block, And a year later, you'll see Austria-Hungary adopt instead the Vorndl Holub. Now, if you're a lesser man than Norris, that would have been extremely disheartening, but that man knows how to hedge his bets, because in the middle of the Austrian trials, before all this really goes down, there's a Danish captain that has been watching the proceedings, and he's impressed by the rolling block. Back in his own country, they have been having some problems, also with Prussia, as you may know from your history, and they are looking to adopt a modern cartridge loader. In fact, they were just about to sign off on the adoption of the Peabody rifle. But maybe this Remington thing might be better. So Norris found the time to pack up a couple of his rifles and a few thousand rounds of ammunition and head to Copenhagen, where he showed it off to the best of his ability. But he had gotten there too late. The Danes had already really put a lot of thought into this Peabody thing, and so that's what they were going to go with. But, you know, they're kind of in a hurry. The Prussians are knocking on their door again. They just lost a lot to them very recently. They'd really prefer to get the guns now, please now. So they actually, when they sent over their officer to the U.S. to secure the purchase and sign the agreements, they said, hey, if they're going to drag knuckles on those Peabodys, why don't you go see if Remington can crank out some rolling blocks faster? And that's what happened. Providence Tool was already busy with a Swiss contract, and so Remington got their gun selected in a 45 rimfire cartridge at first. Now, there's a lot more history to the Danish rolling blocks, but that's going to be another story for another time. Danish adoption introduces the new model. This is also popularly known as the Type 2. The Type 2 features a stepped receiver over the barrel shank, and will be the basis for nearly all foreign-produced rolling blocks from here forward. I should also point out that it introduced the left side extractor. You see, the earlier models used a simple nub on the breech block to withdraw the spent casing. Now we have a left side extractor, an extension on which rides in a groove in the breech block before being dragged open. Now, for there to be a Type 2, we need a Type 1. These are muzzle-loading rifles converted to the Remington pattern. There are a fair few variations, but most recognizable is this 1868 Remington Springfield. Special thanks goes out to the Springfield National Historic Site and Alex McKenzie for sending this along in a hurry for me. For a long time, it was thought that these muzzle-loader conversions came first, hence Type 1. But we now know that they trailed along shortly after the misnamed Type 2. Alright, let's turn our sights over to France. Norris seems to have this unfortunate habit of running in at the end of trials, because France would go ahead and take a look at the rolling block, or at least they tried to, but when they ordered their samples for trial, they took so long to arrive that they went ahead and took the chasse-pot. But, like everyone else in our story today, the French would run into trouble shortly with the Germans. This time, it was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. France was going to put this upstart coalition, led by Prussia, in its place. In hindsight, it was a bad idea. Dang, Bismarck was messing everyone up. Smack dab in the middle of this rumble was one man, Samuel Norris, and he was trying to hawk the rolling block in all directions. Unfortunately, despite offering to arm an entire battalion for free, he went without any sales. As a matter of fact, his messenger was arrested for espionage at one point. It was a mess, but it's a mess that did not last long, because not too many months in, we are going to see that Napoleon III is captured and the French army destroyed. You would expect something like that to be the end of a war, but the French are a weird bunch, because the Third Republic would form and they would fight for another 5 months, reforming an army and having to rearm it from scratch. So the government spun on its heels and went running straight back to Remington to buy everything they had. Everything. Now, there was one problem, which is that Remington was already engaged in several contracts with other countries. You know what? Never mind. I think we can put you ahead of the list. And Remington did ship everything. Now, the bulk of this would be 150,000 Egyptian models in centerfire cartridge, but just about everything else that had already been produced would also be thrown at the French. Remember those early split breech carbines the US government surplused without using? Remington bought those back up cheap and sold them again at an inflated price, along with plenty of muzzleloader conversions, Navy 1870s, various carbines of different designs, and Spanish models flowed in, Greek. It's everything. Everything got thrown at France in a variety of cartridges. There was no hope of even sorting the supply chain on this one, guys. Oh, and speaking of the Greeks, something very interesting here happened. The Greek contract had actually been sort of dinking around. It had been kicked back and forth because the Greeks were trying to pay instead of with cash with government bonds, which apparently nobody thought was all that valuable back then. I can't imagine what the reputation is now. But they didn't want to sell for government bonds, so the Greeks had to come up with the cash. This dragged on, and Remington was getting pretty fed up. And then, right before the French emergency, the Greeks finally pony up, which means that they have a ink-dry contract with punitive measures for lack of delivery, and now Remington suddenly could sell for a better price to France. This is extremely frustrating, so Remington would try everything to get out of this contract easily without the heavy penalties, and the Greeks would realize something was up. And when they figured out that the Remington company wanted to sell to the French at an inflated price, they wiggled out what that price was, and they offered to have it with Remington. Yes, the Greeks took a portion of the profit for sale to France from their own contract that got suspended because it's kind of beautiful, actually, and really, really funny. But the takeaway for France, getting back to the main focus, is that they could rely on Remington in hard times. They could get guns in quick, and with the rolling block especially, there's almost no training required. Because of the unique setup that we'll get to in a moment, you can't really mess up too hard on these rifles. And so it's great for poorly trained, practically illiterate troops who don't know which way to point the thing. Moving on, the Remington rolling block would continue to evolve into what is now known as the third type. It was introduced in 1871 and carried on into 1874. It features extended flares to help protect the stock and still sports that stepped receiver up over the barrel shank. Importantly, it incorporates the Dodge Brothers patent, a retracting firing pin to prevent the floating pin from gunking up and causing slam fires out of battery. It also displays a new, improved rotary extractor. This guy rotates with the breech block to drag out the spent casing. But, interestingly, he would not last that long. In 1874, we move on to the fourth type, which is much the same, except now we have a flush fit over the barrel, and it sports a longer barrel shank. Now at this point in the models, we are really in the Remington rolling block's heyday, because that is the time for these beautiful guys, this one being a Type 4 and 43 Spanish, which is a huge deal. These were sold all over Latinized countries in the world, especially in South America. These things are easily recognized just about anywhere because they were sold so widely for so long. I mean, this was, to that date, the most important military rifle ever made in terms of issuance. So it would take a while for it to be dethroned, and part of that is because despite two big revolutions in small arms, this is an extremely stout and reliable action. Now those two would be around 1870. You start to see the repeater revolution. There's a few years before and after that picks up, but we're talking about magazine loading, repeating firearms are a big deal. And then in 1886, smokeless gunpowder really catches on, and everybody rushes not just to adapt to repeaters, but to smokeless. And in the meantime, this guy, Big Black Bore, is still rolling. So it's a very important gun. As a matter of fact, it really wouldn't be displaced until the invention of probably actually the forever most important gun, the Mauser 1893. This gun cemented Paul Mauser's genius and, like the Remington, spread worldwide, and then some. It was particularly favored in those same Spanish Empire countries as the rolling block, where it chambered the 7x57mm smokeless cartridge. Well, Remington wasn't really ready to give up its presence just yet. It couldn't really compete with the Mauser, but it could tag along. And so they would take this action, an action so inherently strong that it really was underutilized by black powder cartridges, they went ahead and rechambered it and reworked it for smokeless. As a matter of fact, they brought it out again in 7x57mm and sold it to those same countries, because you don't always want to have a repeater bolt action at those times. Sometimes you still have some illiterate yokels that you really don't want to give your best guns to. The process started in 1896, and the first 1,000 or so had a unique sight base, but these quickly settled into the model of 1897 pattern. They feature a narrower thumb piece, longer firing pin channel, and of course chamber a number of smokeless cartridges. Now, because of the rimless cartridges, the rotating extractor wasn't much good anymore, so Remington went back to the linear sliding extractor for just a little while. But that would change with the model 1902, the gun we have here today. The main feature of the 1902 is the Albert patent extractor, which was actually installed in 1901, so names are not very accurate here, guys. You see, this gun doesn't just extract, it ejects. Well, it's supposed to, but I think you'll see ours is a bit lethargic. Before I go any further, I know some of you are going to start yelling at your screen, but Othais, the French contract guns are built off of the model 1910. Well, that's another misnomer. You see, the company Remington merged with Union Metallic Cartridge in 1911, and as part of that, the tang markings here were updated and simplified. And so that's what most people take away from this tang marking, is that they're looking at a model 1910. But again, weird name because that happened in 1911, and it doesn't really apply to anything other than those markings, except they did make one final improvement that I'll show you close up in just a second. But all this brings us right up to the moment that we really care about, which is when war were declared. Now, we've talked about war shortages before. Essentially, everything that could be fielded was fielded. You're going to see very big strains on supply lines, production facilities. You're going to see more soldiers in the field than ever in human history, and they need guns. Now, sometimes you have to produce new guns right away, but sometimes you have thousands of old guns that are sitting around in positions that they don't really need to be in. You can instantly free up a lot more firearms if you can just get them out of the hands of certain guards and rear echelon troops. So anybody that doesn't need a good repeating rifle for sustained fire, well, if you can equip them with something new bought, then you've gotten ahead very, very easily. And that is what the French would do. They would purchase from Remington the rolling block. Now, the first orders would be a small batch of the original 7mm right off the rack, put them anywhere, get them into somebody's hands, let's go. But this is going to add to supply strain, and they'd rather have something that they can use. And it's interesting, but because the Remington rolling block wasn't being considered for new production, it was actually winding down at that point, they had an assembly line sitting stagnant, which was a very rare thing. Right at the beginning of World War I, everybody was being engaged. So if you could turn on an assembly line that was otherwise off, you got guns that aren't taking away from somewhere else. Super important. Anyway, they would go ahead and contract for the production of an 8mm Lebel. All right, with that, let's get a closer look at this gun, and I'll take you through all the features. All right, first things first, what is the rolling block and why is it a rolling block? Well, if you look, we have a circular bodied hammer and then a semicircular bodied breech block. What you can't see now, but you will see in the animation, is that the hammer fits up under the breech block so that the breech block cannot come rearward. It's locked. If we pull the hammer back, it's going to slip out from underneath. See that gap right there, guys? Well, that's going to be just enough room now for this breech block to open. So that means before the hammer can fall all the way, it's already locked the breech block. And from there, we're sealed up tight. It's beautiful because you can't really make a mistake with this. You either can't shoot the gun or the gun is locked. You don't mess up very easily with these guys. It's beautiful for poorly trained soldiers. Anyway, we'll cock her open. We'll open this up and we want to see this extractor because this day extractor is pretty cool. Previously, it would just sort of them out. But now, thanks to this little guy, and let me get the patented plastic pokey hand, right there, that guy, he's going to whip the cartridge a bit. We can actually see this if I bring out a earlier rolling block. There we go. If I retract the hammer, let me get this into focus, there we go. If I retract the hammer and then retract the block itself, we are going to see a continuous smooth pull all the way through. So there's no lump in here, and I'm sorry it's hard to show that, but there's just no pause in that motion. It's one smooth motion because this is a direct rotating extractor. The day extractor has a hump in it, which again, I showed you in that earlier animation, but just to kind of see what that means, I sort of pull this guy, there's some resistance here, and then there's a click. So that click is the moment that it's tossing our spent casing, usually. You will see, just to kind of spoiler alert, we ended up with some sort of swollen case. They were sticking. It was not throwing them clear. So let me go ahead and show it to you now. I have a disabled 8mm Lebel cartridge. I will load, I will close, and then when I pull this guy open under ideal conditions, not 100 years after it was first made, and not rechambered, by the way, for ball N, that may have been a big part of it. This gun was kept in service long enough to see an update. Well, woo, that's actually pretty handy compared to reaching in there, as you're going to have to see Mae do. Anyway, that covers the action, but let's talk about this specific model. Again, being a 1910, we have the simplified tang markings, we have a deep tang butt plate, we have a hand guard with extra metal reinforcement here, although it's still splitting. This would be a recurring problem for these guns. We have an adjustable rear sight, which has gotten bent because it sticks out past its sight base, which may not be the best design choice, because look what happens. We have an 8mm marking right here on the barrel, which makes it easy to identify these guys. And to point out that difference I mentioned between the 1902 and 1910, again, not the best names, but that's what we're going with. Well, let me see if I can balance this well enough. Here is what is considered a 1902 with a sight base fixed directly to the barrel. And then here is our model 1910. This is the only real difference between the two. This is a beautiful ringed sight base that can be pressed over top, much simpler to work with. All right, the last thing to give you is the safety for this gun is a traditional half cock, which means that I pull this guy back for my first click, and that's it. My trigger's locked, my block is locked, everything's frozen until I go all the way to the rear. And since we don't have a lot of half cocks in this show, I should probably point out now, that's where the phrase comes from, don't go off half-cocked. The French would contract for a little over 100,000 of these guys in November of 1914, and I think that was a wise decision. Now, before we kick it over to the animation that you're all expecting, I would like to address last episode one more time and announce an experiment for this episode. So, first, I want to make sure that we thank Rob Brassington for his help with the machine gun episode. The only way we were able to get his help was by helping him. There's no realistic way for someone to work that hard on something and not receive some form of compensation. And the only way we are able to compensate, since monetizing through YouTube is a little odd, since we don't have huge traffic on Full 30 yet, we get our cash from Patreon supporters. Seriously, we get about 8,000 views or so in the first 3 days. If everybody in that group gave $1, we would be able to go atomic with this show. So the percentage of you who have done it so far, you are really driving this effort, and it's why these shows have managed to get longer and heavier and fuller, is because you guys are giving us the ability to go deeper. All right, now with that, I need to say that after showing off Rob's work, we were approached by someone else who we are taking on as an experiment to see whether or not it's possible to get these 3D animations out every other week. They take a lot of work. And again, this is somebody that we are going to try our best to compensate because it's a lot of work, guys. And you patrons, again, are the reason we can do this. So every time you see this show grow, it's from you guys. All right, let's take a look. The biggest takeaway from the Remington rolling block must be the strength of the interlocking hammer and rolling block. When the hammer falls, its round body slips under the cut in the breech block, preventing it from reopening during fire. You can also just make out the firing pin reset lever down in the breech block. The only safety on this rifle is a half-cock position, which locks the trigger and the breech block. Alright, at this point, I think it's safe to turn this thing over to Mae and actually throw some lead down range.
We'll load up a single round. Close her up. And... it sticks a bit. Let's see that recoil. How did I do? Considering all the finagling, not bad.
Thank you, Mae, for doing what no one in the audience wants to do, having to stand outside all day long shooting old guns. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into all the countries and every iteration of this gun. I don't have time for that, I'm sorry guys. But instead, here's a quick roll of most of the countries that issued this particular gun. Now, not all of those were going to be produced specifically at Remington. There would be contracts through the Nagant brothers and Wesley Richards. There's be Whitney copies, and you're going to see a lot of national armories producing their own. This thing got picked up by a number of people, but Remington did make the guns that went to France, and that's what we care about because they were delivered in March of 1915, along with some sweet 16-inch bladed bayonets. So realistically, the best quality about this gun is that it was fast. Not to load, it was just fast to get from market. They were there quickly, just a couple of months and you've got 100,000 rifles ready to go. And by the way, the use is not glamorous, I'm sorry to say. As a matter of fact, they were really just issued to rear echelon troops like guards. These are roles where just having a rifle was sort of necessary. It was the kind of thing you didn't want to leave somebody completely unarmed for, but realistically the sight of a gun or a single round chambered is all it took to frighten away looters or thieves or espionage, I don't know. It's just little stuff where we'd prefer that guy to have a gun, but he doesn't need to have a lapel. We need that at the front. So, they really didn't do anything all that glorious, and they probably weren't fired in anger. But that doesn't mean they're unimportant. They were contracted specifically for World War I. They were contracted specifically to free up guns, and they did free up 100,000 guns that would have been in use somewhere else. And I would like to point out, that's limited just to France. There were other users of the rolling block in World War I. You see, by late 1914, early 1915, the British Navy was being stripped of rifles. They were all being sent to the Army on the continent. They needed everything they could get as well, and it was hard to justify leaving them on the ships. So the British Navy would have to go wherever they could, however they could, to get their guns. And this would include Winchester repeaters and Chilean Mausers seized from ships in port, and, as we've seen before, the Japanese Type 30 rifle. The Navy would also buy off the rack 4,500 Remington rolling blocks. They would be in 7mm Mauser, just like the popular Spanish cartridges, because that's what was available. They would be basically that 1902, 1910 model, although this one's not quite perfect. Same sight and everything. It should be a metal reinforcing piece right here. Otherwise, it'd be identical to this one. And they're not always marked by the British, although some that have been marked for drill purpose later on have turned up. But as they were bought, they were initially issued, by the way, 4,500 of these guys, 76,000 rounds of ammunition, because also those Chilean Mausers they got a hold of. But they were issued mostly to defensively armed merchant shipping. Although they also went along with the Dover Patrol, primarily used to sink naval mines. As a matter of fact, you can find boxes of 7x57 that are marked for mine sinking only. Unfortunately, it seems that the 7x57mm cartridge wasn't always enough to pop the shells of those guys, so, like I said before, a good number of these would get retired to drill practice. Anyway, that means at least 2 nations that definitely use the rolling block, and there's rumors that Russia ordered up to 3,000. Although, whether or not they made it to Russia or were even properly made for Russia, that's up for debate. I see a lot of opinions in both ways, and I have yet to see personally proof that there was this contract. Although it does make a lot of sense, this would be readily adaptable to 7.62x54R, and some chambering that have turned up. It's just whether or not they were actually going to Russia. There's also a Remington cartridge from the commercial side of things that is nearly identical, so take from it what you will. But regardless, an important rifle in 2 positions, freeing up other rifles for the front line. So, not glorious, but still very reliable. Anyway, I personally think that this ended up being a good choice for these nations because not everything can be frontline hard-hitting all the time. A lot of the war was run off the front lines, and they still needed guns. With that, though, we should probably turn it over to Mae and get her opinion in the theoretical sense of what would happen if you had to fire this gun in anger. Well, we said this gun was idiot-proof, so let's get Mae's opinion on shooting the little darling. Here you go. Why don't you start us off with the ergonomics?
Okay. Anyway, ergonomics of this gun. First off, I want to point out it's very small for a rifle and thin, yet surprisingly dense. I was not expecting that when handling this gun. It feels like it's got a lot more weight than it should, especially with the missing magazine, but there you go, surprises. When actually leveling this gun, I noticed that the comb is very high, which I appreciated. I was able to get a good high line of sight. Now, it does not have a semi-pistol grip, which is my favorite. I do prefer that. However, this one wasn't too bad because it's such a steep angle that I felt I was able to get a lot of traction there, so it actually did not bother me while shooting. Now, actually working the action on here, the hammer, it's a solid click, smooth, solid click, smooth. Same with the breech block opening. That is such a kinesthetic joy right there. I mean, it's just, I can't really explain it other than that. It's just, it feels so pleasant when operating this gun. It's kind of like playing with a revolver. It's just got those smoothness breaked up by this clicking. Like, it just feels fantastic in your hand. You just want to keep working the action just to kind of play with it, you know? But as far as ergonomics go in this gun, it was surprisingly pleasant.
I would have to agree that probably my greatest obsession while working with this gun has been the tactile quality of it. Like, you can't just look at a rolling block on the wall. You really want to lay your hands on it because it's immediately rewarding. Everything's oversized in terms of the hammer and the breech block. And it's so welcoming to your thumb. And then once you start playing it, it's that satisfying click. I have to agree completely. But let's get into sort of the hang-up with the gun, which is the fact that this is a single loader. What was that loading cycle like for you?
So in ideal conditions, pull hammer back, open up breech block, load, close breech block, and pull trigger, bang. Should be that simple, right? It didn't quite go as simple on a range, because as you saw, when I was loading a cartridge in, if I didn't line it up just right, it snagged a few times here or there. And after firing, the rounds just didn't want to eject. They just didn't want to pop out properly, like Othais showed earlier in the video. That's probably because of the rechambering on this gun, so that was annoying. And don't get me wrong, if I'm just having some fun with some friends on the range during the day, it's alright, it's not a big deal. but the problem is if I'm in the middle of a battlefield and I've got that one round I've got to load in every single time, and I've got to worry about the extraction on this thing, it's gonna get to you, man. So shooting it in not ideal conditions was fine, or on the range was fine, but I guess in battle it'd be a little stressful.
Yeah, I wish I could say that we had a copy of this gun in the original cartridge. Remember, this has been updated to ball, and post-World War I, we were seeing some stretching and bulging on our case, so it's very clear that it was filling in those passages and getting stuck. You saw with a undetonated case that it threw it clear just fine. That may have been the case for the World War I version, but one way or the other it doesn't matter because this thing really wasn't meant for frontline anyway. We're speculating about something totally remote. But while we are talking about it, I guess I do have to finish with our traditional question. Would you take this into battle?
Abso-freaking-lutely. In 1870. Yeah, no, in World War I had better options, but 1870 against other breech loaders, the trigger on this gun was sweet. The action had, like I said, a kinesthetic joy to it. The sights were beautiful, tall, and my grouping, you guys saw that. I kicked butt with that. The problem is in World War I don't have that magazine. I've got to single load this thing, and you saw the extraction on this wasn't that great. I just know I've got better options. So guys, give me a magazine next time, and maybe I'll give it another thought.
I really don't want to imagine what a magazine conversion for the rolling block would look like. That would be horrifying. But anyway, we have our review, so I'm sorry guys, this is probably not your best fit for the war, but still a beautiful rifle overall. Alright, thank you all for joining us once again. Please stay for the updates because so many things are changing that in the 2 days it's going to take me to edit this, I'm sure I'm going to have even more announcements. We are growing fast thanks to you guys.
Later, everyone.
Alright, let's do our update real quick. We've got to thank the Rock Island Auction House for the support with the images today, especially thanking Springfield Armory National Historic Site for the same. And I do need to mention that Shoot Logic, who we credit at the end of every episode, which is where we do our shooting, they have a charity shoot on November 12th. This will benefit the SPCA. More details can be found at a link in the description, and we will be present and are co-sponsoring. I would also like to welcome to the team Bruno, whose animation was featured today. We appreciate his hard work. He and I definitely had to sit down and work through a lot of bugs in order to figure out how best to do this together. We're going to see if we can get the workflow tight enough to make it a regular occurrence. And again, it's all possible thanks to our patrons. Alright guys, bye.